They questioned her right to be there. No name tag, no rank, no respect, just a quiet woman in a windbreaker. A cadet took one look and decided she didn't belong. Started asking for credentials she didn't have to show, authority she didn't need to prove, until someone spotted a faded tag poking from her bag, scrawled with one word, Valkyrie. And when the general arrived and read that call sign aloud, the room went dead silent. Want to know who she really was and why everything changed the second her call sign was spoken? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The spring wind at Griffin Military Academy cut sharp through the afternoon sunlight, biting even the cadets in pressed uniforms who jogged between buildings during Officer Candidate Week. The academy moved with military precision, boots on concrete, instructors calling cadence the controlled chaos of young ambition under pressure. She walked through the main gate like she'd been there before. Black windbreaker over faded cargo pants. Tactical boots that had been resoled more than once. Ball cap pulled low enough to shadow her eyes. The duffel slung over her shoulder moved with her stride like it weighed nothing, though the way she carried it suggested otherwise. No insignia, no name tape, no fanfare, just presence. A few cadets on the perimeter benches noticed her walking past. Civilian contractor, someone guessed. Maybe some admin's mom, another added with a smirk. Nobody just walks into Central Command unless they're invited. She kept walking with that same steady pace, controlled, the kind of stride that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. The Academy's East Wing stood behind security glass and biometric scanners, restricted access for staff and command faculty. Beyond those doors, Conference Room 4C was prepped for the morning's mentorship rotation, pairing cadets with decorated veterans for conversations that brought human context to combat theory. She was one of those veterans. Major Ridley's invitation had been brief. Come if you can. We need someone real in the room, someone who's bled and stayed quiet about it. These kids need to see stillness that earned its way home. She'd packed that same night. At the security desk, Cadet Mendez, sharp in fresh khakis with a spotless beret, turned toward her with a practiced smile. His name tape was perfectly aligned, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about protocol. Ma'am, this wing's restricted. Visitor parking's back at West Gate. She met his gaze calmly. I'm expected. Mentorship session. Dana R. Carver. Mendez's smile flattened. Even if you're expected, we need military credentials for wing access, especially during Candidate Week. Behind him, another cadet whispered, maybe she's kitchen staff. Dana reached into her windbreaker and pulled out a tri-folded authorization from Major Ridley, signed and date stamped. Mendez took it with exaggerated politeness. Paper doesn't override security protocol. The others exchanged glances, not maliciously, just with the easy skepticism of young men who thought they understood the rules. Dana stepped back and waited. No fuss, no explanation, just stillness. Mendez unfolded the authorization, eyes scanning with obvious skepticism. This just says you were invited to speak. No base clearance, no visible ID. He handed it back. You'll need to wait in the lobby while I verify with command. Behind the desk, admin technician Ortiz stepped over. Mendez, she's on the access sheet. Clearance approved, instructor level. Mendez blinked. She doesn't even have credentials displayed. She's prior service. Escort optional. Ortiz nodded to Dana. You're cleared, ma'am. But Dana didn't move toward the gate. Mendez exhaled, trying to maintain authority. Look, you might be cleared on paper, but walking around in civvies during active rotations sends the wrong message, especially if you're, retired admin? A younger cadet laughed. She looks like somebody's aunt who got lost. Dana looked out toward the training field where recruits lined up for formation runs, their voices carrying faintly through the glass. She walked to the wooden bench and sat, setting her duffel at her feet. Silence radiated off her like heat. As she shifted to ease the strap, a laminated card slipped from her bag's side pouch. Dog-eared, held together by old tape. Most of it faded, but one line remained clear in black Sharpie. Call sign, Valkyrie. Mendez noticed first, scoffing. Call sign? Really? You can't just give yourself a code name and expect people to treat you like special ops. Others laughed, shaking their heads. Dana calmly slid the card back into her bag. No retort, no indignation, just presence. Across the wide hallway, Cadet Jacob Landry sat hunched over a tablet, stylus moving across the screen as he reviewed notes for his next class. He wasn't part of the security detail, just another third-year ROTC cadet waiting for his group's mentorship rotation to begin. Landry wasn't built like most of his peers, thinner, quieter, the kind of cadet who listened more than he spoke, which often made people underestimate how much he absorbed. He glanced up as the commotion at the security desk began to ripple outward in waves of soft laughter and sideways glances. His gaze drifted toward the woman on the bench, then down to the corner of the laminated card that Mendez had just mocked. The name written on it hit him like ice water in his veins. Valkyrie. Landry's stylus stopped moving. He blinked, convinced he'd misread it. But the letters were clear enough, even from across the hallway. That call sign hadn't surfaced in open channels in over a decade. It existed only in whispered stories, heavily redacted after action reports, and the occasional leaked document that disappeared from the internet almost as quickly as it appeared. He remembered reading about Valkyrie in a Freedom of Information Act release, about Operation Firehook, a botched extraction operation in Somalia that had gone sideways when multiple assets came under fire simultaneously. The official report had been redacted to hell, but one radio transmission had survived the black marker. This is Valkyrie. Packages secure. Commence blackout. Landry's pulse picked up. He stood slowly, leaving his tablet on the chair, and crossed the hallway with deliberate steps. His throat felt dry as he approached the bench. Ma'am, he said quietly. Dana looked up, her expression unreadable, but not unfriendly. Something in her eyes suggested she was used to young soldiers approaching with questions they weren't sure they should ask. I saw your identification, he said, barely above a whisper. The call sign. She didn't respond immediately, just watched him with the kind of attention that made him feel like she was reading between the lines of what he hadn't said yet. Were you really Valkyrie? Still no answer. But something shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition of a moment she'd been expecting. Landry's voice dropped even lower. I didn't mean to intrude. If it's really you, I've read about what happened in Bakul province. The insertions without air cover, holding the corridor when everything went to hell. I thought it was just stories, classified legends that got exaggerated in the retelling. Dana studied his face for a long moment. Then, so quietly that only he could hear, she said, What stories? The ones that said you flew 27 extraction missions without losing a single package. That you held off 3 companies of hostiles for 40 minutes while medevac birds pulled out wounded from a compromised LZ. That when the brass tried to give you a Medal of Honor, you told them to give it to someone who needed the recognition. Dana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a moment, something raw and painful flickered across her features, memory surfacing like debris after an explosion. Then she nodded, once, slow, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. And for Landry, that was enough. He took 2 steps back like he'd touched something sacred. Then he turned and half-jogged toward the communications office down the hall, his mind racing toward a phone call he probably shouldn't make, but absolutely had to. At the security desk, Mendez rolled his eyes. Look how jumpy Thompson's getting over there. You'd think the Pope walked in with how excited some people get over old paperwork. Someone else leaned over the counter, chuckling. Maybe she was Air Force. You know how those desk jockeys love their call signs. Probably what she called herself on the base gym treadmill. Dana adjusted her sleeve, reaching into her jacket pocket to retrieve her car keys. The motion pulled the fabric, of her windbreaker, just high enough on her wrist to expose something beneath the cuff. A scar, thin and silvery, running from her inner forearm to just above the bone, and beside it, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo. Not decorative, not elaborate, just simple black ink forming two shapes that most people wouldn't recognize. Twin daggers crossing beneath a raven in flight. The laughter stopped. A corporal standing near the entrance narrowed his eyes, his posture changing in a way that had nothing to do with conscious thought. Muscle memory. The kind of recognition that bypassed the brain and went straight to the spine. He didn't say anything, but his gaze locked on that ink like it held a password he'd forgotten he knew. The room fell quiet for the first time all morning. Even Mendez hesitated, his casual dismissal catching in his throat. The symbol wasn't common. Most people had never seen it. But to anyone who'd spent time around special operations briefings, or who'd scanned intelligence case files from the early 2000s, it rang a distant, classified bell. The Raven and Blades had once been the unofficial mark of a task unit that hadn't existed on paper. Rumor had it they'd flown without IFF signatures during joint operations, ghosts in the air who extracted teams from places no one admitted to being. "Where'd you get that ink?" one of the cadets finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dana didn't answer. She simply pulled her sleeve back down and folded her hands in her lap again. She didn't have to answer, because the silence that followed said everything the words couldn't. Someone in that room recognized the tattoo. Someone remembered the stories. And suddenly, the woman in the plain windbreaker was no longer just a confusing presence in the hallway. She was a question they hadn't been trained to ask. The door at the far end of the corridor opened with the soft click of well-oiled hinges. No announcement, no theatrical entrance, just the quiet sound of regulation boots on polished tile and the subtle shift in air pressure that comes when someone important enters a room. General Marcus Harlan stepped into the hallway like gravity itself, his presence changing the atmosphere without him saying a word. His uniform was sharp but not showy, ribbons and badges arranged with the kind of understated precision that spoke louder than any decoration. A combat patch on his right sleeve bore the outline of a falcon clutching lightning bolts, an old special warfare emblem that most of the cadets wouldn't recognize. His gray hair was cut regulation short, and his eyes carried the particular weight of someone who'd made decisions under fire and lived with the consequences. Cadets stiffened automatically. Those seated stood without thinking. Conversations cut off mid-sentence like someone had thrown a switch. Harlan didn't speak immediately. Just walked slowly down the hallway, his gaze sweeping the room with the methodical attention of someone who missed nothing. His eyes passed over Mendez, over the confused administrative staff, over the suddenly attentive cadets who were trying to remember if they'd done anything worth his notice. He was halfway down the corridor when he saw her. Dana hadn't moved from her seat on the bench. She sat with the same quiet composure she'd maintained all morning, hands folded, gaze neutral. But something in her stillness was different now. Not the patience of someone waiting for permission, but the alertness of someone who recognized a moment of significance. Harlan stopped walking. For several heartbeats, he just looked at her, not in confusion, not in curiosity, in recognition that went deeper than memory and straight to something that lived in the bones. He took 2 steps forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as pieces of a puzzle fell into place. His expression shifted, eyebrows softening, mouth tightening, as disbelief and respect tangled together into something that looked almost like awe. Then, loud enough for every soul in the hallway to hear, he said just one word: Valkyrie. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every cadet turned. Half the staff froze in place. Mendez's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Dana rose from the bench. Not quickly, not theatrically, just with the same economy of motion that had marked every step since she'd walked onto the base. She stood like someone accustomed to being recognized by people who mattered, even when everyone else in the room had missed the point entirely. She nodded once. General Harlan brought his hand to his brow and held a salute. Not the crisp parade ground snap they taught at basic training, but the kind of solemn, weighty gesture reserved for moments when protocol meant less than respect. The kind of salute rarely seen outside of funerals or field briefings before dawn. Dana returned it. Short, controlled, perfect. Mendez stepped back like the floor beneath him had shifted, his eyes darting from Harlan to Dana as he tried to assemble a new reality in real time. The world he'd understood 5 minutes ago was crumbling around him, replaced by something he didn't have the clearance to fully comprehend. Harlan broke the silence with the kind of voice that carried weight beyond rank. "You flew the Zulu corridor, didn't you?" Dana answered without flinching, her voice steady as bedrock. 6 insertions, no air cover, bad communications. The general let out a slow breath that sounded like years of wondering. Jesus Christ. I thought you were KIA after that operation. Nobody ever filled in the blanks. The after-action report just said, successful extraction by unknown asset. Wasn't my job to fill them in, she said simply. Landry reappeared at the far end of the hallway, breathless from his sprint to the communications office. He took one look at the tableau in front of him, the general standing at attention, Dana's quiet dignity, the shell-shocked faces of his fellow cadets, and slowed to a careful halt. His eyes were wide with the kind of understanding that comes when legends step out of stories and into fluorescent lighting. General Harlan turned slowly to face the rest of the hallway. He scanned the young faces, noting how few of them even understood what they were witnessing. When his gaze landed on Mendez, it carried the weight of judgment without malice. "Who questioned her credentials?" he asked, his tone perfectly level. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But they didn't have to. Every head in the hallway turned toward Mendez like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Mendez stood rigid, shoulders drawn tight, his face pale as fresh snow. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound like a fish pulled from water. She didn't have her identification visible, sir," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she had authorization, but I thought—" "You assumed," Harlan said, cutting him off with surgical precision. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The words carried their own authority. "You assumed that a quiet woman in worn boots and no name tape didn't belong here. That she hadn't earned her place in this building. That paperwork mattered more than presence." A long pause filled the hallway like deep water. Nobody breathed. "She flew missions that no one in this room is cleared to read about," Harlan continued, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for the dead. "Her call sign is carved into the memorial wall at Firebase Osprey. There's a ready room at Bagram that kept her photograph under the mission clock, because if Valkyrie was overhead, you were coming home." Even Ortiz, the administrative NCO behind the desk, looked shaken now. She'd heard rumors of Valkyrie over the years, everyone had, but stories have a way of sounding mythical when you never expect to meet the myth walking through your front door. Harlan turned back to Dana, his expression softening into something that looked almost like hope. "Would you still consider leading the mentorship session today?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more personal. Dana didn't hesitate. "I would." "Good," he said. "These cadets need to hear from someone who's survived hard fighting, and then chosen not to talk about it." He looked back over his shoulder, his gaze finding Mendez again. "And Cadet Mendez?" Mendez snapped to attention with the reflexive precision of muscle memory. "Sir, I suggest you listen carefully." The briefing room felt smaller than it actually was. Just a modest semicircle of tables arranged beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with bureaucratic indifference. The projection screen at the front had been cued with slides for some presentation that would never be used, and someone had scribbled Panel 3B, Combat Mindset, on the dry erase board in blue marker that always stained your fingers. General Harlan didn't enter the room with Dana. He let her walk in first, alone, her boots making soft sounds against the scuffed linoleum. She carried nothing but her duffel and a faded manila folder clutched loosely in one hand. She didn't head for the podium or position herself at the front of the room like a lecturer. She chose a seat in the middle row and settled into it like she belonged there. Mendez had already taken a place 2 rows back, his spine rigid as rebar, his eyes darting toward her and away again, like someone trying not to stare at the sun. Around the room, cadets filed in one by one, some with the stiffness of discomfort, others with the cautious curiosity of people realizing they'd just witnessed something they didn't fully understand but knew was important. Dana let the silence stretch for a moment, after the last chair settled and the shuffling stopped. Then she stood. "I was told this session was supposed to be about leadership under fire," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the small space. "But fire isn't always bullets. Sometimes it's doubt. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's a room full of people who've already decided you don't belong." She glanced around the room, not accusing, not defensive, just steady, like someone stating facts that couldn't be argued with. "I'm not here to give you war stories. That's not why I came. But I will tell you one thing." She reached into her duffel and pulled out a folded strip of fabric, an old shoulder patch, worn and sun-bleached, the kind of memento that survived because someone couldn't bear to throw it away. The insignia was unfamiliar to most, a stylized raven over crossed blades, simple and stark against faded black fabric. "Most of what I did can't be taught in this room," she said, placing the patch on the table in front of her. "And most of the people I did it with aren't around to talk about it anymore." She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping but somehow carrying more weight. "You don't earn your place by shouting. You don't earn it by quoting regulations or calling people out before you know who they are. You earn it by standing your ground when everything else is falling apart. You earn it by listening harder than you speak. You earn it by being the last one standing when all the noise stops." A hand went up in the front row. Landry, his notebook open, but his pen motionless. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "when you flew the Zulu corridor missions..." She cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "I'm not here to talk about that mission. I'm here for this one." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with understanding. "Ask me what it's like to lose half your crew mid-flight and still finish the extraction," she said. "Ask me what it's like to get pulled from flight status for 6 months. Because you saw too much too fast and the brass didn't know how to handle the paperwork. Ask me how long it takes for your hands to stop shaking when you pour coffee the morning after bringing home bodies instead of people." No one moved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant engines. "You want to lead? Then learn to carry weight without needing someone to watch you do it." After that, she answered questions, real ones. Cadet Reyes asked what kind of leader she trusted most when everything went sideways. Dana replied, "The one who keeps his voice calm when everyone else starts yelling, the one who makes decisions without needing to explain them twice." Cadet Brookstone asked how to rebuild trust after failure. Dana replied, "Start with silence. Let people watch your next move instead of listening to your excuses. Then make that move count for something." Even Mendez raised his hand, tentatively, like someone touching something hot. He asked what she did when people assumed she didn't belong. Dana looked at him for a long moment, her expression neither cruel nor kind, just honest. "They're not the ones who decide whether I belong," she said finally, "and neither are you." She didn't say it with malice. She said it like gravity, a fundamental law that didn't require belief to function. And somehow that cut deeper than any rebuke. After an hour, the session ended. Cadets left slowly, not in the usual scatter of released attention, but in the quiet shuffle of people carrying new thoughts they weren't ready to share yet. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak too loudly, to break whatever fragile understanding had settled over the room. As Dana gathered her folder and folded the old patch back into her duffel, General Harlan stepped forward and extended a slip of paper. "Permanent base clearance," he said. "Signed it myself. No more questions at the gate." Dana folded it once, slid it into her pocket without looking at it, and nodded. Mendez hovered awkwardly nearby, looking like someone trying to figure out whether he should apologize or disappear. His face carried the particular pallor of someone who just learned that the world was larger and more complicated than his training had prepared him for. She spared him a glance. "You weren't wrong to ask for identification," she said, her voice matter of fact. He looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his features. "You were wrong to assume you already knew the answer." And with that, she picked up her duffel and walked toward the door. No salute, no fanfare, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet authority of someone who'd said what needed saying and had other places to be. The sun had shifted by the time the session ended, casting long shadows across the academy quad and warming the concrete enough to make the air shimmer slightly. The afternoon heat was climbing, but it couldn't burn off the tension that still hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Groups of cadets stood in quiet clusters near the outdoor walkways, their usual chatter muted by the weight of what they'd just witnessed. The rhythm of their steps had changed, less hurried, more measured, as if something about their understanding of the world had shifted, and they were still adjusting to the new balance. Mendez sat alone on a bench under the base flagpole, his cap in his hands, staring down at the worn concrete between his boots. No one laughed at him now. No one teased him about getting schooled by a general. The humiliation he felt wasn't the sharp sting of being corrected by rank. It was the deeper ache of being confronted with his own assumptions and finding them smaller than he'd thought. Cadet Landry lingered near the main walkway, still holding a folded notepad full of questions he hadn't dared ask. Through the glass doors of the admin building, he watched Dana Carver emerge into the afternoon light, duffel slung over one shoulder, windbreaker unzipped now in the warming air. She moved like someone who had nothing left to prove and no need to explain herself to anyone. Landry caught up to her near the main gate, jogging the last few steps. "Ma'am?" he said almost too softly to be heard over the distant sound of drill instructors calling cadence. She stopped, turned. Her face held the same unreadable calm as before, but her eyes were gentler when she saw it was him. "Why'd you come back?" he asked, the question emerging before he'd fully formed it. "After everything you've done, everything you've been through, they didn't even know your name when you walked in here." She looked past him for a moment toward the flag rising over the central quad. The fabric caught the spring wind and snapped with crisp defiance against the pole. "I didn't come for my name," she said. "I came for theirs." Landry nodded slowly, understanding in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to something deeper. There was something both noble and painful in it. The choice to return, not to be recognized, but to remind others what recognition really meant. Dana reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a cloth patch, frayed at the edges where it had been sewn and removed from uniforms over the years. She handed it to him. "What is this?" he asked, unfolding it with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. "My old unit insignia. We didn't wear it on our uniforms, just kept it inside our gear bags in case someone needed to know who pulled them out of whatever hell they'd found themselves in." Landry held it like it might crumble in his hands. "Keep it," she said, "for when they doubt you, too." He opened his mouth to speak, maybe to say thank you, maybe to offer something in return. But she was already turning, already moving toward the parking area with that same steady stride. One hand on the strap of her duffel, the other swinging loose at her side. She didn't look back. Didn't wave. Didn't need to. As she disappeared beyond the gate, a breeze rolled through the trees lining the academy's outer wall. The leaves rustled with the sound of change, and the metal of the flagpole creaked rhythmically in the wind. The afternoon continued around them. Cadets heading to evening formation, instructors finishing their paperwork, the endless cycle of military education grinding forward. But something had shifted. Something unspoken had been planted in the conversations that would happen in dormitories that night. in the questions that would linger in young minds, in the way certain assumptions would be examined more carefully from now on. Not a story, not a legend, a standard, a reminder that respect isn't about volume or visibility, it's about substance. That authority isn't always announced, that the most dangerous people in any room are often the ones who don't need to tell you why. And for every cadet who had seen her walk through that hallway, who had heard the general speak her call sign aloud and watched silence follow in its wake, it would never be forgotten. Have you ever watched someone be dismissed until their true worth came to light? What would you have done if you were in that room when the general read her call sign aloud? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who knows that real respect isn't about titles. It's about truth. More stories like this are waiting for you. Click the next video and we'll see you tomorrow with another story about the quiet heroes who walk among us.